You are in Constantinople in the year 536, and you look up, and the sun is wrong. Not gone. Wrong. It hangs in the sky, pale and dim, like the moon, with no real brightness to it, and it will stay that way for the next 18 months. A court historian named Procopius was living through it, and he wrote down exactly what he saw. The sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon during this whole year. He had no idea what was causing it, neither did anyone else alive. Modern science has a partial answer Procopius never got. Sometime around 536, a colossal volcanic eruption, somewhere on Earth, the exact location is still genuinely disputed, threw enough sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere to form a dense global haze. Sunlight scattered off that haze instead of reaching the ground directly, which is exactly what a dimmer, moon-pale sun looks like from underneath it. This wasn't a local weather event, a cloudy season, or a bad harvest year in one particular region. It was a planetary dimming, thick enough and persistent enough to change how sunlight behaved across multiple continents at once, and it was about to become the worst documented climate disaster of the ancient world. Worst documented not because anyone at the time understood what was happening to them, but because so many people on different continents who had never heard of each other and never would, sat down and wrote out the same wrongness in the sky, in their own languages, for their own reasons, with no idea anyone else was doing the same thing at the same time. In China, the chronicle known as the Nan Shu records something the summer of 536 should never have produced, falls of yellow dust drifting down like snow, and then the following year, frost and snow recorded in August, Chinese August, deep summer, a season that does not usually end in snow anywhere near the regions describing it. Another chronicle, the Beishu, records famine spreading through northern China, severe enough that later entries describe people resorting to cannibalism simply to survive the winters that followed. In Europe, contemporary writers described a dry fog that dimmed the sun for a year and a half, crops fail in 2 years running, wine that wouldn't ferment properly because the grapes never fully ripened, and a cold that didn't behave like any winter anyone remembered living through. None of these observers were in contact with each other in any way. A scribe recording famine in southern China had no possible way of knowing what a Byzantine court historian was writing down at the same moment, thousands of kilometers and an entire unmapped world away. And yet they were independently describing the exact same wrongness in the same sky. The proof that actually ties all of this together didn't come from any of those ancient writers, careful as they were. It came 14 centuries later from trees. A dendrochronologist named Ulf Böntgen and his collaborators studied the stable carbon isotopes locked inside subfossil tree rings preserved from this exact period. Wood that had been quietly recording the exact conditions of every single growing season it lived through, long before anyone thought to ask it a question. What they found was a signal so extreme it stood out as the single most severe episode of short-term cooling anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere in the last 2,000 years. A dip in sunlight and growth so sharp it registers nearly 3 standard deviations below the long-term average, the kind of anomaly that in almost any other context would look like an instrument error rather than something that actually happened. And the tree rings revealed something the ancient chronicles alone never could have shown, because no single observer lives long enough to notice a pattern spanning decades. This wasn't one bad year from one eruption. There's a second major eruption around 540, and a third around 547. A cluster of shocks, not a single event, compounding into what climate scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. a cold snap that reshaped growing seasons across Eurasia for more than a century after the first dimming had already come and gone. Here's what that changes about the story. It's tempting to picture 536 as one terrible year the world simply endured and moved past, but if the real pattern was 3 eruptions across roughly a decade, hammering already strained harvests again and again before they could recover, that's not a single bad harvest. That's a society getting hit while it's still down repeatedly for longer than anyone living through it could have known to expect relief. The human cost shows up in records that have nothing to do with astronomy at all. In China, the imperial government suspended normal taxation for over a decade, from roughly 538 to 551. A policy that only makes sense as an implicit admission that ordinary harvests simply weren't happening across huge stretches of the country, year after year. Famine spread across multiple regions on multiple continents in the same narrow window, entirely independent famines by any local account, all clustered around the same handful of years. And just 5 years after the dimming began, in 541, the Eastern Roman Empire was hit by an entirely different, entirely devastating catastrophe, the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, on this scale anywhere in the historical record, later known as the Plague of Justinian. Historians are still careful about how directly to connect the two. A multi-year famine doesn't automatically cause a plague, and correlation across a handful of years isn't proof of a mechanism, but a population already weakened by years of failed harvests, already malnourished, already stressed, and moving in search of food, is a population with far less capacity to survive whatever arrives next. The timing at minimum is not comforting, even if the exact causal thread remains genuinely unproven. And here's what's still unresolved. Even with 14 centuries of hindsight and ice cores and tree rings that ancient chroniclers never had access to, scientists still don't agree on which volcano actually did this. Microscopic glass shards recovered from polar ice cores, laid down in the spring of 536 itself, have been chemically matched to material resembling Icelandic volcanic rock. A genuinely strong clue pointing to the North Atlantic. But other researchers have proposed a separate source entirely, somewhere in the high latitudes of North America, based on different lines of evidence that don't cleanly agree with the Icelandic match. Nobody currently alive can point to a single spot on a map and say, with full confidence, this is where it started. The haze reached everyone. The mountain that made it is still, in a real sense, missing. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that the most consequential single year in a huge stretch of ancient history was caused by something nobody involved could see, name, or locate. Procopius could describe the wrongness of the sun in precise, careful language. A trained historian doing exactly what a trained historian should do, recording what he witnessed as accurately as he could, and it still told him nothing about why it was happening, because the actual cause was an eruption on the far side of the world, in a place he had no way to know existed, let alone visit. He had the evidence in front of him every single day for 18 months, and the explanation was still completely out of reach. We have satellites now, and ice cores, and isotope analysis that would have looked like pure magic to a 6th century court historian, and we still can't say for certain which mountain did it, on which continent, in which specific month. Maybe that's the honest lesson underneath this one. Some causes stay hidden, not because nobody's looking, but because the distance between witnessing something and actually understanding it can outlast the witnesses themselves. And sometimes, as this one shows, it outlasts even the much better equipped people who come looking for the answer, with better instruments and better records many centuries later. Procopius wrote down the truth of what he saw as precisely as language allowed him to. The truth of what caused it was simply somewhere his sentence couldn't reach, and in some ways, ours still can't either.